not going to run again. I decided not to because Marilyn and I have a book we have to finish. We titled it How to Follow the Sermon on the Mount Without Becoming a Wimp.
Oh, wow.
And it takes the principles of the Sermon on the Mount and says they are really powerful principles. They're the only things that have worked in the mediation room for us the last 40 years. And I also want to, authors tend to stick together. I want to peddle a book here. Bruce Carlson has written many books, but this is a great one, Your Aging Body. When I first looked at it, it looked like Your Aching Body. Bruce is over here, and you can talk to him about the book. It really helps take the mystique and fear out of aging, and I think it makes getting older, like all of us do, it makes getting older easier because you know what's going on when you read his book, and it's not so frightening. So, I first encountered Dietrich Bonhoeffer when I was a student at Augsburg in Minneapolis from 1964 to 68. Bonhoeffer was a favorite of one of our religion professors, Paul Sonic. Paul later ended up officiating at our wedding, and he introduced the class to Bonhoeffer's theology. At the time, I was sort of grappling with the decisions to make about the Vietnam War and my role in it, and I had a very low draft number, and some of my friends were going to Canada, some were filing conscientious objector status. And my best friend from grade school on up dropped out of the University of Minnesota in 1966, and rather than get drafted, he joined the Army because they said, you can choose your profession. And he became a helicopter pilot, and he was there 3 months before crashing on a mission in bad weather, and he died. And you can visit him, and you can honor him at the Memorial Wall in D.C. He's on panel 16E, line 21. I visited him several times, and I still get choked up. Mm-hmm. But hearing Dr. Sonic describe in class how this German Lutheran pastor interpreted Christian theology to accompany, embrace or encompass a theology of resistance to the evils of the Nazi state apparatus intrigued me. I think it planted a lifelong interest in the question I want to address today. But one more thing about what piqued my interest, and one observation about this next little story. I was confirmed at Roseville Lutheran Church by a pastor who was ultra-conservative and whose every sermon, it seemed, exhorted the congregation to make a personal commitment to Jesus and become saved. He was fond of altar calls and theatrics like that, and it never kind of made sense to me. However, I did graduate from college, and Roseville Lutheran had a policy that if anybody went to seminary, the church would give them $300. That was a lot of money when we were just married. So I went over and met him, and I said, I'm going to seminary. Can I get my $300? And he said, certainly. He'll see that the church sends over a check to Luther Seminary in my name for tuition. I said, well, I'm not going to Luther Seminary. I'm going to Union Theological Seminary in New York. And suddenly his face got reddened, and he said, that communist seminary? Never. And I didn't get my $300. But I cite it as an example of how politics, religion, and all of this stuff gets caught up in people's thinking and their actions, and it's not that easy to figure out. So hopefully we can at least create some new questions for ourselves today. But with that history behind me, I was ready to learn about this young German theologian who's captivated so many by his story. So the question I want us to consider today is, what is the response of a Christian to any government that asks its population to assist in the persecution or confinement or expulsion, or for that matter, the planned execution of certain segments of its population, as was experienced by Germany and its citizens during the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis? This is the question that Bonhoeffer grappled with, and it's with this question in mind that I want to explore certain aspects of this theology of resistance to evil. This focus on resistance is a small part of Bonhoeffer's overall work, but how he answered this question, I think, gives us a great deal of insight into almost all aspects of his thinking. It helps us understand why his legacy continues to grow and continues to be relevant to all of us, not only in these divided and trying times, but also in the ordinary trials and tribulations of a Christian's daily life. So, after graduating from Augsburg in '68, I applied to several seminaries out east, but I wanted to go to Union for a variety of reasons. One reason was its focus on social justice, and also because it's where Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a mentor to Bonhoeffer, still taught. And I studied at Union from '68 through '70. And coincidentally, Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been a Sloan Fellowship student at Union in 1931. And again, in 1939, he was offered a professorship, but he turned it down to return to Germany to be a pastor to his people. During his time at Union, he made friends with a number of Americans, as well as students from other countries attending Union that year. In fact, he made connections with students from England, Switzerland, and Sweden that helped him during his travels in the early 1940s as an ecumenical representative of German Lutherans, while he was clandestinely operating as a counterintelligence spy for the German resistance. Bonhoeffer was born into privilege in 1906. His father was a professor of psychology and neurology, as well as a medical doctor. His mother was from a long line of distinguished German educators and lawyers. He could have had an easy life, I think, given that he was born into wealth and status. But his early acts of defiance came in seeking to side with the Jews, who were increasingly being persecuted. In 1934, still in his 20s, and by then an ordained Lutheran pastor, he gave an address titled "The Church and the Jewish Question," where he urged the church to resist anti-Semitic Nazi legislation that required pastors of Jewish descent to be immediately dismissed from their posts. Bonhoeffer challenged this immoral legislation and called upon the churches to come to the aid of victims of injustice, whether they were baptized or not. And he further said that the action should be taken not just to bandage the victims under the wheel, but to jam a spoke into the wheel itself. That was kind of recorded as one of his first public statements of active resistance. The thing I found about Bonhoeffer is Bonhoeffer was about acting and doing, not about sitting in a pew and thinking, boy, I'm saved. Yeah, that's great. Now I'm going to go down to an altar call or something. His life was one of action, and it was centered, curiously enough, around the Sermon on the Mount, and I'll get to that in a moment. But even though he said, let's jam the spoke in the wheel, he said there may be times in the advance of justice when it becomes necessary for the church to resort to direct action against the state. He was still in his 20s when he started speaking out like this. And unfortunately, he was almost alone in his opinion at that time. It was in the early days, and well, let's go along, it's not that bad, and you know. Throughout the rest of his life, he remained committed to speaking out on behalf of the oppressed, as well as opposing the formation of a national German Reich Church. In the mid-1930s, the German state church, they didn't call it a state church, but it really was. It drifted towards what is essentially called Christian nationalism in our country today, where the state and the church are kind of together, all doing the same thing. Yeah. Where mainstream German churches took the position that they were German Christians, they call themselves Deutsche Christen, believing that Christianity found its appropriate expression in Germany through German culture, and that Hitler was completing the work begun at the Reformation by Martin Luther. If you read some of Martin Luther's later writings, he was pretty anti-Semitic, and the Nazis pounced on that and carried it forward and said, well, let's all work together to do this. Bonhoeffer's response was to form the Confessing Church, and he did that in 1934 with a group of ecumenical students which rejected assimilation with that Nazi ideology. He believed that the situation urgently demanded that the church confess its faith anew in response to the issues which now confronted it. And let me parenthetically add here, it was really fun to prepare for this because I went back and reread some of this stuff. And if you wonder what really motivated Bonhoeffer, from my reading, and I think some of the commentators would agree, almost all of his work, and from the commentators who've spilled thousands of pages, it appears that at the core of his belief system was a view that the authentic life of the Christian was based upon the directives found in the Sermon on the Mount. The message given by Christ and fully described in Matthew set forth a life of action, he writes, not just of contemplation. Right. And I brought along his book, Ethics. I was just looking at it. I've had it a long time. I see it in the corner. I bought it for $1.45 new. Tell you how long I've had it. But this is, I think, partially an explanation of why he took or could create a theology of resistance to immoral and illegal and sinful actions. Bonhoeffer rejects the notion that ethics should be concerned about explaining right and wrong, which is impossible, he says. Rather, we must look to God and obedience to his will. The solution is to do the will of God, to do it radically and courageously and joyfully. That is the only thing an ethic should concern itself with. He says doing is different than contemplating. And on November 18, 1943, Bonhoeffer wrote to his close friend Eberhard Bethge just after he arrived at prison, Tegel prison, when he was first arrested, and he was being held by the Gestapo. And he said, I, for my part, have been reproaching myself for not having finished ethics. No doubt part of it has been confiscated. Some of the manuscript for this book was retrieved in hiding places in the garden in a monastery he had been hiding in before he was arrested. And tying in with what Michael said today, I'm so glad you talked about freedom, because he finds freedom is given in obedience and action towards following the Christian path, not determining who's right and who's wrong. And he talks about judgment, and judgment is an important part of our work, where we don't make judgments on people. If you say something's right and something's wrong, that's only, we call that a binary choice. You either got two choices. You're either right or you're wrong. And the reason I left the practice of law is it got to be completely, somebody wins, somebody loses, somebody gets custody, somebody loses custody, somebody's a good parent, somebody's a bad parent, and life is a little bit more complicated than that. So when Jesus says in Matthew on the Sermon on the Mount, judge not lest you be judged yourself, Bonhoeffer says, he writes, judgment passed on another man, and it's always using man, so think of it as
human.
the other half, mankind. Yes, think of that when I say that, but I'll read what's in here. Judgment passed on another person always presupposes disunion with that person. It is an obstacle to action, but the good of which Jesus speaks consists entirely in action and not in judgment. Judging the other person always means a break in one's own activity. That's from the ethics book. he says further, it is evident that the only appropriate conduct of men before God is the doing of his will. The Sermon on the Mount is there for the purpose of being done. He did not see the Sermon on the Mount as aspirational, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the poor. In fact, at one point he wrote in a letter, I don't know that had he lived with how he would pull this off, but he said, well, the church should really sell all its property and give it to the poor.
Yeah.
And then, for you, Michael, he says in here, there is no freedom without first responsibility.
Yeah.
And obedience to the will of God and the Spirit, and following Jesus' commandments and prescriptions and suggestions that we live a life that is completely, radically new and different. When the Sermon on the Mount was first given, it must have seemed pretty radical to those people sitting on that mountain back several thousand years ago to hear, love your neighbor. Mm-hmm. If you're estranged from your brother, reconcile with your brother. If your neighbor sues you for your coat, give it up. Give it up. And then this one, love your enemy.
That one really is.
So it was pretty radical then, and of course it's pretty radical right now.
Exactly.
But if we're to survive as a human race, we have to start listening to some of that. Mm-hmm. Because where's this warfare and jails and weapons? And we have, just the United States alone has 13,000 nuclear weapons, enough to blow up the state of Rhode Island and more, I suppose, or the world. We must reject the notion that we should try to always explain right and wrong. And we must look to God in obedience to his word. Interestingly enough, when they were putting the ethics book together, Bonhoeffer, they found an outline that Bonhoeffer had made of an additional chapter he intended to write on love and responsibility. It contained the heading notes, one of which was Politics and the Sermon on the Mount. He was never able to write these chapters because his life was cut short. But, and I'll just, in the beginning, in his book, he says, stations on the way to freedom. And this fits in with what you were saying about costly grace and cheap grace. He coined those terms. If you set out to seek freedom, this is stations on the way to freedom. The first one is self-discipline. If you set out to seek freedom, you must learn before all things mastery over sense and soul, lest your wayward desirings, lest your undisciplined members lead you now this way, now that way. Chaste be your mind and your body, and subject to you and obedient, serving solely to seek their appointed goal and objective. None learns the secret of freedom save only by way of control and obedience. Obedience to the Lord, Christian life. Do and dare what, this is now action. He's got a second station. He has 4. I'm only going to read the first 2. Action is the second one. Dare, or do and dare what is right, not swayed by the whim of the moment. Bravely take hold of the real, not dallying now with what might be, not in the flight of ideas, but only in action is freedom. Isn't that an interesting sentence? Not in the flight of ideas, but only in action is freedoms. If I could accomplish some of the things I think in my mind, I'd be a great person. Not in the flight of ideas, but only in action is freedom. Make up your mind and come out into the tempest of living. God's command is enough, and your faith in him to sustain you. Then at last, freedom will welcome your spirit and great rejoicing. So, There's another book that really, I found really useful, The Cambridge Companion to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I think it's about 15 or 20 authors who all are scholars of Bonhoeffer, and they all write about some aspect of his life, his spirituality, his ethics, his resistance. Great book. I'll recommend that to you. We talked about putting the spoke in as, of course, these things and many others were beginning to draw the attention of the Gestapo. The Gestapo put a muzzle on him and said he could no longer speak, he could no longer publish, but he was somewhat protected by the fact that his brother-in-law was the director of the Abwehr. If I'm saying it right, I'm not a good German. Abwehr, Abwehr, which is what was the counterintelligence unit of the German army.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll tell why that's important in a second. But shortly after his arrest in 1944, Bonhoeffer shared some of the deepest thoughts he had with some of his fellow conspirators. And this was before the assassination attempt on Hitler was still in the future. He was aware of that, but he didn't really participate in it other than being aware of it and transmitting some of the information to some of his contacts in other countries when he was trying to act as counterintelligence. But he wrote on the day that the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler occurred, he wrote, "Civil courage, in fact, can grow out of the free responsibility of free men, free people. Only now are the Germans beginning to discover the meaning of free responsibility. It depends on freedom this morning, right? It's perfect. He and I didn't talk this morning.
Yeah.
It's like we did.
It depends on a God who demands responsible action in a bold venture of faith, and who promises forgiveness in consolation to the man who becomes a sinner in that venture." So I suppose it's kind of maybe close to a theology of assassinating evil people. I mean, it gets,
Pushes the envelope.
anyway. But here's a list of the actions that Bonhoeffer engaged in. Give me 5 minutes, and I'm almost done. As he followed the course of actively resisting evil. That was what he actively felt it was necessary to resist evil. In the early 1930s, of course, he began speaking out against the growing persecution of the Jews. In 1939, he refused to sign a declaration that all German clergy members of the Deutsche Christian, of the Lutheran State Church, sign an oath swearing an allegiance to be loyal and obedient to the Fuhrer. Sadly, almost all of the regular church signed that declaration. In 1939, he traveled to America to accept an appointment to teach at Union. He only stayed a couple weeks before he realized that was wrong, and I'm going back to Germany to help my people. Toward the end of the 30s, Germany was tilting increasingly towards ranking as one of the most tyrannical governments in all history. And through his brother-in-law, who was a leading member of the Abwehr, his brother-in-law obtained an exemption for Dietrich for serving in the army. And of course the Abwehr was the center, really, of the main center of any resistance that occurred, although it was never enough to completely, Soviet armies and the American armies had to take and do it. But he was able to get that deferment because the Abwehr director said that Dietrich's counterintelligence efforts would be extremely helpful to the Abwehr because he'd be able to kind of learn what other countries are thinking or doing because he's traveling around. But in fact, just the opposite had happened. He used his travels during this time to put some further spokes in the wheels of tyranny by attempting to foster connections between the Allies and the small resistance group that opposed Hitler. And in 1941, he was instrumental in the implementation of a top secret resistance plan to assist in smuggling Jews out of Germany. And he secretly crossed the borders 5 times to Switzerland, Norway, and Sweden in furtherance of getting the Jews out of Germany. And interestingly, in 1942, he met with an English Bishop, George Bell, in Sweden at a secret location, and he provided Bishop Bell information about the size, locations, and names of the resistance movement leaders in Germany, in the hope that this information would be passed to Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, and other leaders of the War Department, with urgent requests for assistance, and especially for support in helping negotiate a peace when the resistant leaders were able to eliminate Hitler. And unfortunately, there was no response from any of the Allied leaders to this request. Finally, he was arrested in 1943, imprisoned, and he. Let me 2 more minutes. I wanna cover some other items that we don't have time to get into. Costly grace versus cheap grace. It's described in his Cost of Discipleship book, and it basically says that the life of the Christian is a difficult path, and it's more than. He was worried that so many people in church would mouth and contemplate things like helping the poor and this and that, and then, well, grace will take me a long way. Through grace I'm saved, but I'm sorry, you got to do something too, and it was action that he relied on. He also, towards the last year he was in prison, he began to write about what he called religionless Christianity. And we don't know much about it other than a few writings, but he was so frustrated with the fact that the German church, supposedly being centered in Christ and love, and was unable to do anything against the onslaught of Hitler and the Nazis and their tremendous evil pathways. His view of Christ, he says, God wanders among us in human form. He preaches, speaking to us in those who cross our paths, be they stranger, beggar, sick, or even those nearest to us in everyday life. I really like that. That's where God is in the midst of all of us. His view of the church community, much similar to what your scripture reading was today. Life in the Christian community is what he calls the life principle of the new community. It's the free, loving, self-giving of Christ, which takes 2 forms: being with each other and being for each other. The Christian life is a shared life, not a private spirituality. It is a life of bearing each other's burdens, being Christ to one another, and being for each other takes very practical forms: self-renouncing, actively working for the neighbor, intercessory prayer, and finally the mutual forgiveness of sins in the name of God. God's transcendence is not remote otherness or absence. God's otherness is embodied precisely in the other person who is real and present, encountering me in my heart of my existence without judgment and the grace and with the grace of the gospel. And finally, I want to close with, there's a long poem that Dietrich wrote to his fiancée 4 months before he was hanged. And this poem is included in many textbooks. It's fairly long, but I want to just read the last 4 lines, because I think his life ended on a positive note, and I want to leave us on a positive note when we look around and see what's going on in our world. He writes, these are the last 4 lines. While the powers of good aid and attend, boldly we'll face the future come what may. At even and at morn, God will befriend us, and oh, most surely on each newborn day. Thank you. And I hope that we Christians can continue to try to follow the exhortations found in the Sermon on the Mount. And I pray that whatever the future may hold for each of us and for this country, that the love of Christ expressed in the gospel will prevail over whatever evil tries to snuff it out.
Thank you.
Questions? You got any thoughts? Any? Kind of a heavy-duty challenge, isn't his life?
Steve, have you read a biography of Bonhoeffer?
Well, I picked this one up thinking that it was going to be a good one. This one has a lot of stuff, but this is the one, that movie. There's a recent movie out, a couple years old, and it's sort of based on this. Eric Metaxas writes this. It's got some new stuff that I didn't know, but they took the book and they made a movie, and it kind of twisted things around. And I think the group that did the movie was a group that favors Christian nationalism, is what I've read. And so they used it to kind of advance, they used his life in a movie about him to advance their cause. And I think that's out of order.
The thing that strikes me, and I kept listening over and over, and it reminds me about action and not just faith and prayer and hopefulness and all good intentions and all of that, but action. So I have been doing, because I think we're in a very difficult time in our lives in this country. So I have been doing some things that are active in protest, but it reminds me that how important that is, and that was a real emphasis that I heard, that I appreciate from Bonhoeffer.
Yeah. And he, and as between him and Hitler, who stands the test of time? Who do we revere? Yeah. Wow. I don't think you can read Bonhoeffer without sort of gaining a deeper understanding that the gospel is more than just some words about this. He says the Bible is the window that is to God. And it's the way, for me, just reading and trying out the Sermon on the Mount is one of the things that I've seen only though that pathway works when we're doing mediations, when people are in conflict. They get starting into blame and fault, judgmental, and we don't go anywhere. But if we can move back into recognizing that they're connected, and I always start every divorce mediation with the phrase, now as we've signed the agreement to mediate and keep everything confidential, can I ask the two of you to agree to approach things from the point of view that says, you can only get a good result for yourself in these negotiations with my help, when you also help the other achieve a good, fair, just result. The connectedness that we have. And I don't think you can read Bonhoeffer without realizing that, well, he says it, it's in the connections, it's in the daily life that we find Christ, that we find the meaning of the gospel, and that's so important. Yes?
I took a course in college. I was a political theory major, and I took a course on the nonviolent direct action of Martin Luther King. And in there we studied Gandhi, we studied Leo Tolstoy, I think we touched upon Bonhoeffer. The whole idea of action being resistant, nonviolent action. And that's what you're talking about, this whole thing. How does one do that?
Right, and I also ask myself the question, how do you know which path to take? Well, that's where he says the Holy Spirit will lead you.
There we go.
If you're open to the leadership of Christ and love, and you'll find the answer.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
This helped me more than probably any of you, because I got back into why I like him so much, and I think we've just scraped the surface here. But it's interesting how consistent. What you said today is exactly what his message is.
Yeah, yeah. The gospel is still the same.
That's right. It
Yeah.
hasn't changed over time much, has it?
Yeah. But in spite
Just
of
our interpretations.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
Oh, yes. About Bonhoeffer? Maybe you know Bonhoeffer. What book you asked me if I'd read a biography. Is there a good biography of him
I
that
don't
you'd
know.
recommend?
That's why I asked, I don't know.
Some of your books.
What about the one
Yeah,
that has all kinds of writers?
This is an interesting one here. I saw this, it's in paperback, I just looking this morning. Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. I would recommend it. It's in paperback for $12.95 on Amazon.com.
Who's the author of that?
Metaxas, Metaxas.
But it was how it was used, this thing that you were saying.
Hmm?
It was used by the conservative.
Yeah, it was used.
That's, yeah.
But the book itself
Is good.
is good, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, but they twisted it around and then they added a bunch of things for
Their
filmography and editing. Somebody raised their hand over here. Yes, Bruce.
Well, I was saying, you were cross-referencing Michael's sermon. You should have also at the same time been at UCC where they were talking about James and, faith without works is ineffectual, works without faith is empty. But it's the same message that Bonhoeffer was trying to.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point.
Somehow, I don't know, somehow Luther's, by faith alone are you justified. That somehow got blown out of proportion and we forgot the other stuff called action and putting a stick in the spoke of the wheel of sin and tyranny and so forth.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate the